Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our dialogue. In today's episode, the cost of living crisis, why Britain can't afford to live anymore, we are turning our attention to one of the most significant economic pressures currently facing the United Kingdom and increasingly many advanced economies around the world. Because over the last few years, something has fundamentally changed in Britain. The cost of everyday life has risen at a pace that many households simply haven't been able to keep up with. Energy bills have surged, food prices have increased exponentially, rent has become increasingly unaffordable, mortgage payments have risen dramatically, and across the country, many ordinary households now feel financially strained in ways they never did only a few years ago. But what makes this cost of living crisis particularly important from an economic perspective is that this is not simply a story about how things become more expensive. Rather, it reflects the interaction of inflation, wages, energy dependence, housing shortages, monetary policy, taxation, and long term structural weaknesses within the British economy itself. Because inflation alone does not automatically create a crisis. A country can experience inflation while wages continue rising alongside prices. The issue emerges when the cost of living begins rising faster than incomes, faster than productivity, and faster than the people's ability to adapt. And that is increasingly the situation Britain finds itself in today. And at the same time, the crisis has exposed several deeper vulnerabilities within the UK economy. Because across Britain today, there is a growing sense of frustration and uncertainty. At the same time, policymakers remain divided on how the crisis should be resolved. Should governments intervene more aggressively? Should interest rates remain high to combat inflation? Are current economic pressures temporary? And ultimately, this raises the central question for today's discussion. Is Britain simply experiencing a short term cost of living crisis, or are we witnessing the gradual erosion of the comfortable British middle class that defined much of modern Britain's economic identity? For today's episode, we are joined by esteemed guest speaker Mr. Joshua Hinton, who currently lives in the UK and goes to the Sleaford Joint Sixth Ford. He'll be taking business A levels and is extremely interested in further bettering the economy of the UK. So, thank you, Josh, for helping us unpack the causes, consequences, and broader implications of today's ongoing economic pressures. Is there anything else you would like to add to introduce yourself?
No, that's all. Thank you for having me on here. And if you want, I can get onto the first point of why I'm here. And I'll just quickly explain what the cost of living crisis actually is. So, what the cost of living crisis actually is when the wages are not high enough, but what everything costs is going through the roof. So, your food, your water, everything is skyrocketing in prices, but your wages, they're not going anywhere. So, what it really is falling real incomes and living standards. Everyone has less disposable income. So everyone is feeling poorer. You can't buy anything. You can't do this. You can't go out with your mates because you're just trying to buy the essentials. Lots of it is water, food, energy. Like, what can we do to actually get it up?
Thank you so much, Mr. Josh, for this exuberant explanation of the cost of living crisis in general. And it's really great to have you with us today. Today, we are also joined by jaw dropping hosts Demir Hossain, Zumar Sheikh, and Mohammed Ariful Kabir. So, before we move into specific policies and economic outcomes, uh, I wanted to ask to begin the discussion, what exactly caused Britain's cost of living crisis, and why was the UK hit so hard compared to many other developed economies after COVID 19? Mr. Zumar Sheikh, I see you have something to share with us, and I know you would start the podcast off in an amazing way.
Thank you so much, Supreeth Nagella, for your beautiful words about me. And I would also like to thank Josh from joining us all the way from the UK. Big round of applause at home. I love Josh so much. I've known him since I was a kid. He used to go to our school. And yeah, but when we talk about this UK cost of living crisis, we need to understand that it wasn't only caused by a single event, but rather a series of economic shocks that hit British households almost simultaneously, or like one one after another. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, global supply chains were disrupted, creating shortages of everything from food ingredients to industrial materials. And then in 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered a surge in global energy prices, causing gas and electricity bills across Britain to skyrocket. Because energy is a key input for almost every industry, higher energy costs quickly filtered into the prices of food, transportation, manufacturing, and housing. As inflation accelerated, it reached over 11% at its peak. Many British households found that everyday necessities were becoming dramatically way too expensive. However, while prices rose rapidly, wages failed to keep at pace. For years, the UK had already been experiencing relatively weak wage growth, meaning workers entered the crisis with little financial cushion. The result was a decline in real incomes, where people's paychecks technically increased, but their purchasing power fell. A salary that was once comfortable covered rent, groceries, transportation, and utilities suddenly felt inadequate. For many families, the crisis wasn't just reflected in economic statistics. It was felt every time they paid an electricity bill, filled up a car, or visited the supermarket. This is why the cost of living crisis became such a powerful political and social issue. It created a widespread feeling that almost overnight everything had become way more expensive while living standards were moving backwards. Now, I hope everyone at home understood what I was talking about, but I think now we should pass it on to Josh here, our expert regarding the UK cost of living crisis. So, Josh, right now I have a question to ask you. Was the UK's cost of living crisis simply the result of a temporary global shock like COVID-19 and the Ukraine war, or did these events expose deeper weaknesses that have been building within the British economy for years?
Personally, I think they expose deeper weaknesses. And one of the things is why we hit so hard is because we're a small island. We're very vulnerable. We import lots of our energy and everything. If international prices go up or down, that's how it affects us. So why do energy prices go so high? Household bills increase, businesses' costs rose, inflation spread through the economy, and it just went in a spiral of the decline. Like, what are we meant to do there? And not unlike other countries with loads of resources, like America, they pump oil, Alaska, the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, you've got everything. Britain, we've got a bit of the North Sea. Apart from that, we don't have much more. I'll pass it on to Demir with his hand up next.
Thank you, Josh. So, building on what Zumar and Josh said, I believe that we can characterize the UK's mishaps from the Ukrainian war and COVID-19 as cost push inflation. And for our viewers at home, that means that there's a fall in the supply or the production in the country as a whole, in the country's GDP. And so we can see that resulting from this increase in these prices, firms were not able to produce as much as they were able to previously, as the economy now has shrunk. And what this results in is not only a decrease in the real GDP, an increase in price levels, aka inflation, but it also increases unemployment, which I think is one of the catastrophic after effects of the inflation of these things. Because if more people are being unemployed in the UK as a whole, that is just one of the more reasons as to why the inflation hit this country of Britain so hard. So now I'm gonna pass it off to Araf by asking him, did Britain's inflation problem begin because people were spending too much, or because businesses were facing higher costs? Araf?
Thank you for the prompt, Demir. I think that Britain's inflation problem was caused mostly by both demand side and cost push factors, because overall businesses facing higher costs played the biggest role in this part. So after COVID hit, there was definitely an increase in consumer spending because economies reopened and governments had injected large amounts of money into the economy. And then right after that happened, people began spending again on travel, food, and services, which increased the overall demand of the market. Now, this created some inflationary pressure, but however, like the larger issue for this was that the businesses themselves were facing dramatically higher costs. Global supply chains were also disrupted after COVID, which made imported goods more expensive and harder to obtain. And shortly after that, we know that the Ukraine war caused like energy prices to surge across the whole Europe, which affect transportations, manufacturing, and like overall production of businesses across Britain, and which suddenly made it face much higher operating costs. As a result, companies raised prices to protect profits and survive with like rising expenses. And this is what is known as cost push inflation, as we learned in economics. And moreover, Britain was also more especially vulnerable because it relies on heavily on imported energy, like Josh said. And Brexit added further pressure through labor shortages and trade friction, which increased the costs even more. So to answer your question, Demir, while increased consumer spending contributed somewhat to like inflation, I feel like the UK's crisis was mainly driven by businesses facing rising production and energy costs, which were then passed on to like consumers through higher prices. So yeah.
I just want to add something on here quickly. When we say the biggest triggers of it is COVID and Ukraine war, yes, that was. But something else happened, which I don't think anyone has mentioned yet, is Brexit. Brexit didn't cause the cost of living crisis itself, but Brexit likely made Britain way more vulnerable because we had tariffs, everything, reduced investment. We couldn't go and work abroad. There was loads more paperwork, just so much hassle for businesses, which also made them go and base elsewhere because they don't want all these tariffs, these interest rates, all this and that. They just want to get as much profit as they can. Every business's main objective is profit. So, and the EU is Britain's still biggest trading partner, and we've lost all the partnerships with that, or not all of them. But we tried to say, we'll do it all ourselves. We'll be our own independent. And look, we've gone running back to them now. 41% of the UK's exports went to the EU, and 51% of imports came from the EU. That's how reliant we were on them. And after Brexit, the businesses faced loads of custom declaration problems, regulatory checks, more paperwork, so much compliance costs. And when over 40% of your exports and more than half of your imports involve the EU, even the small trade barriers, the small percentages can create significant economic costs for us.
Thank you so much, Josh. And your mentioning of the Brexit is very important because you're absolutely right. After this, resource costs became harder, and the procurement of other goods and services and the imports became more expensive. All of this leads to increasing costs for firms in the UK, and that obviously leads to rising prices. So I just wanted to ask you, from your own experience living in the UK for many years now, what are some of the biggest changes you've personally noticed over the last few years in terms of everyday expenses, and has it been like financially noticeable for you and your family?
For me and my family, it's not particularly been financially noticeable, but it's been noticeable in a way of what you're eating and what you're drinking. So let's say 10 years ago, you go and you buy a chocolate bar in the store called Tesco, a very well-known superstore. You go in there, you get a 60-gram bar, 90p. Okay, that's fine. You now you're going into thing. So what companies now do is, instead of increasing the price, they make the product smaller. So if you compare the sizes of a chocolate bar from 10 years ago and you compare the price of a chocolate bar now, it'll be about half the size, but double the price. They're doing that to try and hide the rising costs and what is going on. And also water prices shot through the roof, energy prices, people having to not use their heating or anything because they simply can't afford it. And that's over half the UK. Loads of people in the UK just can't simply afford everyday essentials. And how do you expect them to go and live a good life? It's a bit iffy. But over to you, Demir.
Yes, very insightful, Josh. So I just wanted to ask the crowd, ask anyone in particular, that do to solve and deal with these rates of inflation, these increased problems that the UK are facing, should the UK government intervene and implement their own policies, thereby taking on debt and increasing inflation, or let the market readjust per the neoclassical model? Zumar?
Demir, that is a beautiful question. But before I begin to respond to that or answer that, I just wanted to say that Josh's insight into his like specific insight, since he lives in the UK, was very insightful. As the example of the chocolate bar that you gave us, I haven't really read about it or heard about it ever regarding how like inflation really does affect the average household. So Josh, thank you so much for that beautiful insight. And Demir, to respond to your question here, I think that this is one of the biggest debates regarding like cost of living. On one hand, supporters of government intervention argue that when essential goods such as energy, food, and housing becomes unaffordable, the government has a responsibility to step in and protect households. During the peak of the crisis, many British families were struggling to pay their heating bills and afford basic necessities. In situations like this, policies such as energy subsidies, targeted welfare payments, rent support, or temporary tax relief can provide immediate relief and prevent a significant decline in living standards. Furthermore, because of the inflation and how it was driven by external factors such as the Ukraine war and global supply chain disruptions, many economists argue that households should not bear the full burden of shocks that are largely beyond their control. However, others argue that excessive government intervention can create new problems. Subsidies and financial support programs are expensive and can increase government borrowing, while measures such as price controls may discourage investment and create shortages. From a more free market perspective, higher prices send signals to consumers and businesses to adjust their behavior, encouraging energy conservation, greater efficiency, and increased production over time. As supply chains recover and energy markets stabilize, supporters of this view believe that the market will naturally bring inflation down without the need for large-scale government intervention. In reality, the answer may lie somewhere in between. Completely leaving the crisis to market forces risks causing significant hardship for millions of people, while excessive intervention could place additional strain on public finances and distort market incentives. The challenge for policymakers is that finding a balance between providing short-term support to vulnerable households and implementing long-term reforms that address the structural issues behind the crisis, such as housing shortages, low productivity growth, and energy dependence. The real question is not whether the government should intervene, but how much intervention is necessary without creating new economic problems in the future. Josh, I believe you wanted to talk about something or add something on.
Yeah, so personally, I think with you saying the government intervening, it's not how much they intervene, it's how they do it. What I personally think is instead of trying to artificially lower the interest rates and try and bring everything down, we should try to develop a stronger economy, a stronger base for our economy. So that could be building more homes, that could be investing in infrastructure, improving transport to attract investment, FDI, foreign direct investment from other countries, which we already have lots of, increasing the domestic energy production so we are less vulnerable and less reliant on other countries, and reducing exposure to global shocks. What we can do as well is get better education, even though we are top tier in terms of our education, but we can improve our education and workforce training. So personally, I think with a wide variety of projects, so there's HS2, which connects London to Birmingham and Manchester, but that's been a bit cancelled now, so there's only part of it been built. And there's a new Heathrow runway which is meant to be built, a third runway, and what they're expecting for that to do is increase the amount of investment which we can bring into London. So it should, if it's built by 2050, increase our GDP by about 0.5%, and that is quite significant in terms of we can bring more businesses in. Loads of businesses recently have been going out of our country because it has become not a good place for your business to be. You want somewhere that is stable, somewhere that can bring you profit. We're not that currently. So personally, I don't think the answer is just letting the market sort everything out or letting the government shield everyone from economic reality because we can't hide from it forever. Interest rates had to rise because inflation was out of control, but the government's role should be addressing the structural problems of our economy, such as housing shortages, low productivity, energy dependence, and not just lowering our interest rates artificially. The real solution isn't cheaper money, it's building a stronger economy that can tolerate normal interest rates without causing a crisis. Supreeth?
Thank you so much, Mr. Josh. And you really brought up a broader debate surrounding government spending, wealth, as well as how they're working on financing these periods of economic pressure. Because in recent years, we've also seen that Britain has faced the challenge of balancing weak economic growth, but with increasing public expenditure and increasing fiscal deficit. So, for the viewers out there, a fiscal deficit is the additional burden, loan burden taken by the government to finance their high government budgets. So we know how the government, the UK British government, needs to fund healthcare, pensions, public sector wages, etc. These are the basics, and especially during the cost of living crisis, we know how this is important. But at the same time, we have seen how government borrowing has become increasingly expensive, and this is also due to higher interest rates, meaning fiscal pressure has intensified significantly. However, critics argue that this creates another economic dilemma because obviously, to fund these government budgets, we need taxes. And we have seen how the British government has been increasingly raising the taxes over time. And this has also contributed to high net worth individuals, investors, and even entrepreneurs leaving the UK and moving to other countries like the UAE or Singapore. So, Mr. Joshua, I wanted to ask you: Do you think, uh, do you think Britain should now lower the taxes, maintain the taxes, or increase taxes? And how do you think we should mitigate the potential outflow of wealth? Because this would lead to longer term consequences for Britain's economy and further uh, ameliorate the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, great question. That it's quite a tricky situation because you can't make everyone a winner. With every decision you do, there will be losers and winners. If you raise the tax, the millionaires they go off. Like the UK, we have lost so many millionaires since 2024. We've lost 9,500 millionaires that are liquid. You know what that does for our economy? That means we've got lower amounts of tax coming in, and what you actually don't know, or what you could know, is this is what has really got to me, is the UK's public sector accounts for 100% of all of our debt, everything. And the national debt is about 2.8 trillion, which I don't know how we can get over that. But debt interest payments cost the government tens of billions of pounds every year. And the more tax revenue, every time we increase tax, that all goes towards the debt. It doesn't go particularly towards developing our country. It just goes towards the debt. And less money is available for public services because with our government is changing rapidly as well. We've had 4 or 5 prime ministers in the past 5 years. We've not had a stable political party for ages. We've got people that want to get military spending gone, but now we've reduced our military spending. We've got one of the weaker militaries. We can't afford anything in terms of militarily. We've got one boat out in near Iran. What are we meant to do with one boat? Like, it's horrible. And household debt is about 120 and 130% of disposable income. We have got so much debt in the UK. I don't know what we can do without it or with it.
Or what you've mentioned, all the statistics, this has truly been insightful. I never knew things were as dire than what they truly appear. And I think one of the less discussed aspects, like you mentioned, is that British government itself needs to manage what they're spending their taxes on, the tax revenue on, because we know households are struggling with rising costs, and personal household debt. But the government is simultaneously dealing with rising debt and is increasing the interest payments on that debt. And like you mentioned, the UK government currently spends over 1.3 trillion pounds annually, while revenue from taxes was substantially lower. And in the 2024 to 2025 financial year alone, the government ran a deficit of roughly 153 billion uh, pounds. And like you mentioned, public debt is almost 96% of the GDP, and most of the UK government's budget debt is caused by social spending and social expenditure. And this really makes us think about why this is happening. And then I remember about Brexit. So, Araf, I think this is actually a really interesting point to bring into the discussion because, unlike many younger people who were strongly against Brexit, you've previously mentioned that you were relatively supportive of it, or at least supportive of it, of some of the arguments behind Brexit. So, looking at Britain's economic situation today, Araf, with rising living costs, slower growth, and broader public frustration, do you really believe Brexit was the right long term decision economically?
The thing with Brexit, Supreet, like, it's not like I fully support it. It's just like interesting because Brexit is a very complicated issue because a lot of like original arguments behind it were understandable. And many people did like support Brexit because they wanted Britain to have like more control over its laws, immigration, trade, and like other economic decisions, which is um, understandable because they're choosing this with this other than like relying on the European Union as a whole. Honestly, I think some of those concerns were valid, but economically, it's difficult to like ignore the fact that Brexit created additional pressure during an already like unstable period, which left the EU like introduced to like more trade friction and like labor shortages and supply chain inefficiencies. Businesses suddenly like faced higher costs and more complications, especially while the world was already dealing with COVID and an energy crisis during that time. Now, I wouldn't say Brexit alone caused Britain's economic problem. A lot of the countries experienced inflation and rising living costs after COVID and the Ukraine war, like I mentioned before. However, I do not think like Brexit made Britain less flexible and like more vulnerable during those like shocks. But at the same time, you could also say Brexit has also made like a long-term project for Britain. Supporters would also argue that the UK now has more independence to create its more like own trade deals and economic policies. But those benefits may also take many years to fully appear or like fully act out. So overall, I would say that I still understand why people support Brexit politically and economically, but in like short term, like medium term, it's clear that Brexit added like a lot of pressure to the economy that was already struggling with deeper structural problems like weak wage, housing shortages, and like low productivity. I actually want to have like some insights of Josh there for this topic because like I'm not the one living in the UK here, so like I'll just move this on to Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Araf, for that. Adding on to your point, there was two different goals for Brexit. It's either if your goal was based on economic growth, I don't think, or from an economic perspective, I would say Brexit has underperformed expectations and put a good bit of pressure on us because we've had to do everything ourselves now. We were quite reliant on the EU. But if, let's say, our goal for Brexit was sovereignty, because we did want that, we wanted to control its own laws, we wanted to control our immigration policies and negotiate our own trade deals. So we have a greater political autonomy. And if those objectives were the priority of most of the country, which they weren't, I'm just going to mention, supporters would have argued that Brexit was definitely succeeded. But personally, whether Brexit was the right decision depends entirely on what you actually value most. If your primary goal was maximizing the economy and getting most money in, doing best, and getting a strong base for us, the evidence so far suggests that Brexit has imposed a lot of costs through weaker trade, investment, and productivity, and is not benefited us in a great deal. But let's say if your primary goal was actually sovereignty and democratic control, then Brexit has achieved much of what its supporters wanted. And I think that's where the UK is starting to turn to. We want our sovereignty. But with our sovereignty, we're not a lot. We need the US, we need the EU. If we get hit with tariffs and trade deals, our economy could crumble quite quickly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Josh. That truly makes sense, especially the way you explain it with how and why some people wanted Brexit and why Brexit may not have been the better decision in the long term. So, so adding on to this really brings us to the most important policy question facing Britain today. Because inflation has fallen from its peak. At one point, UK inflation exceeded 11%. Today, it's fallen to around 2.8%. But viewers, we need to understand the difference between the price level and inflation. Knowing that inflation has fallen does not mean that the price levels have fallen. This means that the rate at which prices were rising have simply decreased. However, the difference in the price level from maybe around 10 years ago is significantly much greater than what the price is today. This means that food is still extremely expensive, housing remains unaffordable, just a dream for many, and energy costs remain elevated. And for this reason, Mr. Zumar Sheikh, knowing that you are the top economic student at our school, I wanted to ask you, as a policymaker, if you were advising the government today, what would be your priority? What would be the specific policies you would suggest the government take on? Would you focus on tax cuts? Would you focus on greater public spending? Would you focus on housing reform and, like Joshua mentioned, building more houses? Or would you focus on policies aimed at boosting productivity and wages?
Supreeth, thank you so much for the question. This is a very big question that I feel like I am able to unpack right now. If I were to advise the British government today, my priority would not be tax cuts or short-term spending measures, but rather tackling the deeper issue of long-term economic growth. Inflation is falling significantly from its peak, meaning the immediate emergency phase of the cost of living crisis is beginning to ease. However, many of the underlying problems that made Britain vulnerable in the first place still remain. For over a decade, the UK has struggled with weak productivity growth, stagnant real wages, housing shortages, and underinvestment in infrastructure. These issues cannot be solved simply by giving households more money through tax cuts, because if the economy's productive capacity does not increase, higher demand may simply lead to renewed inflationary pressures. This is not to say tax cuts or public spending have no role. Targeted support can help struggling households in the short run, and investments in areas such as transportation, education, healthcare, and energy infrastructure can strengthen the economy over time. However, if I had to choose one area to focus on, it would be housing reform and productivity growth. For example, the government could reform planning laws to make it easier and faster for developers to build new homes, expand affordable housing programs, and provide incentives for local councils to approve housing projects. This would help address the chronic housing shortage that has driven rent and housing prices far beyond what many young people can afford. On the productivity side, the government could expand vocational training and apprenticeships, increasing investments in research and development, offer tax incentives for businesses investing in new technologies, and continue major infrastructure projects such as rail, broadband, and renewable energy networks. These policies will improve the UK's productive capacity and support higher wages over the long term. Ultimately, I think Britain's biggest challenge today is not inflation itself. The larger challenge is rebuilding an economy capable of generating sustainable growth and rising living standards. The cost of living crisis exposed weakness that had been developing for years, and unless those structural problems are addressed, Britain risks facing a future where economic growth remains sluggish. Public services remain under pressure, and the middle class continues to feel squeezed. The real test for policymakers is whether they can move beyond managing crisis crises and begin creating the conditions for long-term prosperity once again. Rather than focusing solely on short-term measures such as temporary tax cuts, Britain would prioritize structural reforms that increase housing supply, boost worker productivity, encourage business investments, and strengthen the country's long-term growth potential. Josh, I believe you wanted to add on or talk about what I was saying here.
Yeah, actually, I just want to quickly add on to Supreeth's point with the price rises and inflation. A lot of people think that just because inflation falls, it means that the prices are also coming down, but that is not how it works. I'll give you a quick example. Let's say a loaf of bread costs £1. In year one, it is still £1. In year two, it's £1.10. So that means the inflation was for that year was 10%. Year three, it's £1.13. It means the inflation for that year was 3%. And then let's say the government hit you with a good news, the inflation has gone down from 10% to 3%. But the bread is still £1.13, but the value of your money has gone down. So the price is still rising, just a lot more slowly. It's like driving a car. You can slow from 70 mile an hour or kilometers an hour to 20 mile an hour, but you're still going forwards. And I think that is a key driver of all the problems. Demir, you had your hand up there.
So going on Zumar's point about implementing economic policies that tackle long-term growth and these very interesting policies, I just want to talk about how, okay, let's say the government spends all this money to get rid of unemployment, to drive jobs up, right, to increase growth. Now, is that worth it in terms of opportunity cost of the potential inflation and hyperinflation which the government can experience? Because in the past, throughout the analogs of history, we have seen instances where a government, in trying to spend on its economy, in trying to prop up the economy, increase long-term growth, has found itself in situations of hyperinflation and increasing inflation and inflationary spirals. An example I can give you is Bolivia. As Bolivia in the 1980s was in the same situation, as their unemployment was increasing, and their inflation was increasing. Thus, the government tried to spend as much as it could to prop up the economy and to increase employment rates. However, this led to the government facing hyperinflation and suffering as a whole. So my question to you, Zumar, is that while we need to consider long-term economic growth, is it worth the potential of hyperinflation and inflationary spiral which the economy of Britain could experience?
Demir, I think that is a very insightful question that you asked me. And thank you so much for asking me that. While we need to absolutely consider long-term economic growth, I don't think Britain is facing a risk of hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is an extreme scenario where prices rise by hundreds or even thousands of %, often because governments are printing excessive amounts of money or because there has been a complete collapse in confidence in the currency. Examples could include Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Britain's situation is very, very different. Although inflation reached double digits during the cost of living crisis, it remained far below hyperinflationary levels, and the UK still has an independent central bank, stable institutions, and credible currency. The bigger concern is the trade-off between stimulating growth and keeping inflation under control. If the government were to aggressively cut taxes or dramatically increase spending without increasing the economy's productive capacity, demand could rise faster than supply, creating renewed inflationary pressures. However, policies aimed at increasing housing supply, improving infrastructure, and investing in education and boosting productivity are different because they increase the economy's ability to produce goods and services. In theory, this allows growth to occur without generating the same inflationary pressures. So the question isn't whether Britain should choose between growth and inflation. The challenge is finding policies that promote sustainable growth while maintaining price stability. In many ways, weak growth may actually be the greater long-term threat. A country can recover from a period of elevated inflation, but if productivity remains stagnant, the living standards fail to improve for years. The economy risks being trapped in a cycle of low growth, declining competitiveness, and increasing public frustration. Demir, did that answer your question?
Yes, that was sufficient. Thank you.
Now, Araf, I have a question for you. While we need to consider long-term economic growth, is it worth risking higher inflation in the short term?
Zumar, I think it's like it really depends on like the type of inflation or like and like what is causing it. For example, a small amount of inflation is actually normal in a growing economy because it usually reflects higher spending, investment, and economic activity, right? But in some cases, governments may accept slightly higher inflation in the short term because it helps avoid like a recession or like while they're like focusing on protecting jobs or like encouraging long-term growth. However, the danger actually comes when inflation rises too quickly and wages fail to keep up. At that point, living standards begin falling and like savings lose value and ordinary households face serious financial pressure. And I feel like that's exactly what like Britain experienced through like during the cost of living crisis. Josh, correct me if I'm wrong. And like the real challenge is like mostly balance. And governments want to like have enough economic growth to create jobs and investment, but they also need like inflation to remain controlled and predictable. If inflation suddenly becomes too high, central banks will like the Bank of England often rise interest rates aggressively, which can slow growth and like hurt households through higher mortgage costs. So overall, Zumar, I think like some short-term inflation may be acceptable if it like supports long-term growth. But if inflation starts damaging like living standards among the public and like it reduces confidence, then I feel like it becomes economically and politically dangerous, if that makes sense. Supreeth, I see your hand raised there. Yeah, you can go on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Arf Kabir. It really made sense how you explained the trade offs between inflation and short term economic growth. But, Mr. Joshua, I wanted to ask you a major concern surrounding the British economy right now, and that's the probability and possibility of a recession because we see that after COVID 19, the reason prices rose so significantly was because of the lack of supply and the increased expenditure. However, considering this, now that we are past this short term COVID 19 correction, economic shock, we need to realize that because of how slow UK's productive capacity has grown and how small it's becoming because of the structural inefficiencies in the market, do you seriously think that Britain is at risk of entering a deeper recessionary period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So personally, when I think of Britain, I think at risk of recession, we're not, I don't think, but I'm more concerned about the long-term stagnation than a big collapse of our economy. When people hear the word recession, they think of the 2008, a banking crisis, mass unemployment, and severe contraction in the economy. I don't think that's most likely the scenario today because we have a stronger banking system. Inflation has come down significantly from its peak, even though it is rising now, and employment has remained relatively high. However, Britain does face several structural challenges that could keep growth weak for years. We have a housing shortage, pushing up rent and house prices. Productivity growth has been sluggish since the financial crisis of 2008. Public debt is high, but population is aging. We've got not a very young workforce, and there are ongoing pressures on the public services like the NHS, the RAF, the army. What is we doing? Because there is such a peak on defense now. Defense is one of the drivers of every economy. The US, they have all of their money. Loads of their money comes in all from defense, exporting military goods. These aren't necessarily ingredients for a deep recession, though, but they are ingredients for a long period of economic underperformance and not particularly being where you want to be as a country. But what's particularly worrying is that many people already feel as they're living through a recession with our cost of living crisis. Even when official GDP figures suggest that the economy is growing, their food bills are higher than they were a few years ago. rents remain really high, mortgage payments have increased, and wages haven't kept pace with the rise of the cost of living. So there can be a disconnect between what the economic data is saying and what people are experiencing in their daily lives. And I think that is a key point. People in the UK feel that we are not going anywhere, but the statistics are showing that we are. It's because of the cost of living. The prices of everything is just skyrocketing through the roof. But at the same time, I don't think that we should be overly pessimistic. Britain still has major strengths. We're globally respected everywhere. We have universities. Loads of people come to our country because they want to experience our culture. They want to experience the universities. We've got Cambridge, we've got Oxford, we've got LSE, London School of Economics in London. We've got a strong financial sector. We've got Canary Wharf. We've got world-leading industries in areas such as life sciences, which is also in Cambridge, and technology, and institutions that attract investment from around the world. The country has the capacity to grow. The question is whether we can address the underlying issues that hold us back, such as our housing shortages and just everything.
Thank you so much, Mr. Josh. And the way you outlined Britain's strength is truly exhilarating. However, when I search up and research, I see that the UK unemployment overall is at 5%, which is cool. However, when you look deeper, you see that the youth unemployment is at 16.2%. Yes, a staggering 16.2%. And do you think this is an indicator for something worse in the future of the economy? What do you think about this unemployment rate, considering you are soon to graduate and also be in the job market?
Yeah, I'm currently also working, so I'm not part of the unemployment. But if youth unemployment remains significantly higher than the overall unemployment, it can indicate a lot of deep problems in our economy, such as our future economic growth problems. If there are young people in the future workforce, just saying, if they're unemployed, underemployed, or not gaining the skills, a lot of people my age don't have the skills to become a good worker. We don't have the experience. Then our productivity will just suffer even more because we've not got anything behind us. You're just someone there who's working, and today's unemployed is 22-year-olds, tomorrow missing skilled worker. You need to go through education. You need to go through all this. But we've also got a very weak social mobility system. Like historically, work was the main route into the middle class. If young people struggle to get the jobs and progress in careers and buy homes, what we haven't actually gone through in a big thing is the average age to actually buy a house now is over 30 years old. A house which used to be worth 80 grand 20 years ago is now worth about 400 grand. How do you expect a 20-year-old working on 30 grand a year with tax, so he's earning only about 18 grand a year, to pay for a house which is worth 400 grand? You're not going to be able to do that. And the hard work which people are putting in and trying to develop skills is not translating into economic advancement as easily as before.
Yeah, very insightful, Josh. And something which Josh, I think, hinted at earlier that I want to touch on is the idea that economic counters, economic ways to measure inflation and the cost of living, they don't consider all the factors, right? Like that's why we have multiple ways to measure economic growth. But what I'm trying to get at is that there are parts of UK society which these economic indicators do not measure, and these indicators that do not touch on. So I think it's interesting that Josh is talking about social mobility or the average age to buy a house, because I think this is something that needs to be considered as well, as the UK as a whole is not only determined by its economy and what the economic indicators identify. There are other factors which we need to also take into account in order to measure the willingness of the UK to prosper. So I thought that was very interesting, as hinted at by Josh. Zumar, would you like to add anything?
I just wanted to say that thank you so much for Josh from joining us all the way from the UK. I know the time difference there, I think, is five or 6 hours behind us. So I'm very grateful that you have graced us with your presence today. Thank you so much. I love you, bro.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hamdan.
Supreeth, did you mention anything?
Thank you, Josh. So I just wanted to ask anyone. I'm throwing this on the table. Uh, we know how the top 10% of households in Britain own around 57% of total wealth, while the bottom 50% own less than 5%. That's staggering. This truly showcases the wealth inequality in Britain and truly underlines how the cost of living crisis, especially to the majority of the population, has been significantly impactful. And I just wanted to ask, considering how this structural wealth inequality is a problem, how do you suggest we counter this wealth inequality while ensuring economic growth and ensuring that the billionaires don't run away because of higher taxes either? So this is like a trade set of trade-offs between three different points. Of course, Mr. Josh.
Yeah, so with that question is how do we reduce the wealth inequality without damaging investment, entrepreneurship, and our economic growth? But I think the goal shouldn't be a quality of the outcome. It should be a quality of the opportunity. We should be allowed for the young workers to gain experience and for everyone to have more opportunity, not just the wealth. The challenge is ensuring more people can participate in wealth creation as well without undermining the incentives that drive economic growth. Big companies own everything. It's a bit like a monopoly. Is the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And without government intervention, nothing can change. But I think the biggest thing which should change is housing. To fix the housing first, because housing is the biggest source of wealth inequality in Britain. This divides people who own assets and who don't. Owning assets in the UK economy is the only way you can be kind of stable and you've got something behind you. So what the solution could be is just building more homes, getting more things, reforming more planning, increasing the housing supply. This improves affordability without punishing people's success and taking away homes from the richer people. Because if you take away their homes, punish what they have earned, they're just going to go to another country. They don't have to be in this country. So I think the fastest way to reduce the wealth inequality isn't taxing the wealth, it's helping more people own assets and build their own portfolio up.
So, follow-up question to that, Mr. Josh. We see that around 350 to 400,000 people in Britain, in the UK, are homeless. And based on that, let's say the government does want to build houses. How would they, if not the government, who do you think should build the houses? And how do you think they would be able to reduce the costs? Because building a three-bedroom home could cost the government on average about £200,000, and £200,000 times 350,000 homeless people would be impossible to take care of. And also considering the idea of building houses, we need tax revenues to build these houses. But how do we get tax revenues without raising the taxes on the rich? So what do you suggest? And this anyone else can
Yeah.
answer.
That's a great question, but I just want to quickly clarify something. When people hear that loads of people are homeless, they imagine on the street, rough sleepers in outside superstores. But in reality, a lot of it is in temporary accommodations such as sofa surfing, living in hostels, or insecure housing places where you've not really got, you can't call it home, but you've still got somewhere which is comfortable, even though there is still people fully out on the streets. But a lot of it isn't as bad as you think. But I think the realistic answer with who should build these houses, where do we get this funding from, is I think the private sector and the government need to work together. But the pros of private development is they build pretty much all the houses in Britain already, and they have loads of expertise and capital. They can deliver the housing at a large scale without a massive economic effect. But the thing is, they're a business, they're a private company. They want the most profit as possible. They release the homes gradually to keep prices from falling too quickly. They want money. They don't want people to have homes because it doesn't affect them. So that's where I think a lot of it is not greed, but businesses just want money. And the thing is, with, let's say, if it's government housing, the government, with the money, they can build social housing. They can target the affordability rather than the profit of the businesses, and they can house vulnerable populations, so the people who are living on the streets. But the main problem with that is it's expensive for taxpayers. The planning takes a long time. The bureaucracy, the laws take a long time. And a lot of the UK's projects, the public projects, such as HS2, that railway, it's not gone very well. They were expecting a small little budget, but then they've exceeded that budget by about 10 times, and it's gone to 60 billion for a railway. So I think the housing crisis is too large for either the state or market to solve alone.
Okay, so what you said is actually very insightful. And like you mentioned, the idea of the private sector and the government working together is interesting. However, you also mentioned that that firms want to maximize their profits. So what's the incentive for firms to build houses with lower profit margins? And how would the government convince them to do that?
That's a very good question. I personally think they're just going to have to lower the business tax rates for certain companies. I don't know if you can do it through law or how you can do it, but they're going to have to boost something. They might either they could just say, we're going to lower your interest rates, or not your interest rates, your tax rates. We're going to give you funding. We're going to make sure you have buyers, because a lot of these people, they can't afford to. It's not the fact that there's not any homes available. There's no affordable homes available. There's plenty of homes about, but people can't buy them. What they're trying to get is the businesses need a strong demand. The homeless people and people who are not as well off, you don't have a demand from them because they simply can't afford it. I think what it is the private developers are going to have to develop and build them, but like they do before, the government is going to have to buy it off them and then lease it themselves for a cheaper rate. And I think they will just have to take an economic loss, personally.
So thank you, Mr. Josh. Truly insightful, truly genuine, and the answers really start to make sense. And I just wanted to leave it out to the floor before we do the wrap-up session for today. Do the other hosts or the guest speaker want to say anything else?
Josh, I absolutely love all the input that you have given us throughout this episode. And I just wanted to say that I really do think that all the insight that you've given us really does make like you one of, if not the best guest speaker we've had on this channel so far, from last season or this season. Really, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say thank you for attending this meeting.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Yeah, we enjoyed conversing with you. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So
Sorry,
to bring this, yeah, of course.
Before you wrap up, one more thing that I wanted to say was, Josh being from the UK, and especially this episode being based regarding like the UK, I think it really did strengthen the appropriateness or how good the insight was that was given. So thank you so much, Josh, again.
Thank you so much. So to bring this discussion together, we have seen in this conversation that Britain's cost of living crisis is more than just a simple isolated event. And it's an interaction of inflation, wage growth, housing pressures, taxation, public debt, and a lot more that we can keep on talking about. It's a long conversation. And while inflation may be falling, many of the deeper pressures are still remaining. And for that reason, before we wrap it up, I would also like to bring this back to you, Mr. Josh. Is there anything else you would like to say about the Dollar Dialogue podcast?
No, I think it's a great concept, this Dollar Dialogue podcast. I think what you guys are doing is really insightful and allowing people to just listen, especially if they're just on the bus, on the train, they can just listen and gain some insightful views. I really think it's a great idea. Thank you for having me on today as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Josh. Thank you for joining us today and contributing to such a thoughtful discussion. And thank you to you viewers and everyone else for listening. If you found today's conversation valuable, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more episodes of Dollar Dialogue. And that's Dollar Dialogue Season 2, Episode 5. the cost of living crisis, why Britain can't afford to live anymore. Thank you again to our beloved viewers. And next week, we are back with another very interesting discussion and another very interesting guest speaker. That's Dollar Dialogue for now. Thank you and see you guys next week.